Good morning, class. We are going to be talking a little bit about the 1950s so that you can kind of get a gist of what it would have been like to live back then. It was a very different time from now, especially when it came to being a teenager. So we're going to go back in time and just take a peek at what's going on so that when we get to our reading, you'll kind of have an idea of what you're looking at and what the norms were at that time. So here we go. America, the 1950s. So World War II had ended, and America had been quite victorious in this war. So as the soldiers came back, you can see this iconic photo of the sailor kissing this random nurse he didn't even know, just because it's such a marvelous thing that the boys are coming back, that the war is over, that we were in victory in this war against the Nazis. And so in 44, which is a year before that war ended, they came up with the GI Bill. And what you need to know about this is that it really did help out with things like going back to school so that a soldier who is away at war could come back and get an education and get a better job. And it helped them with other things like buying homes. So one big takeaway from this one is that it spurred the growth of the economy of the 1950s. So the 1950s were a good time, especially if you were a white person. I say that because you're going to see why in a minute here, towards the end. All right, so the national income is going great. People have money to buy extras that they didn't have during wartime when things were rationed and money was slim. Around this time also, the conservatives were a little sick of the Democrats controlling the White House, and so the 22nd Amendment came about in 1951 that limited presidents to just 2 terms or 10 years maximum. Another interesting thing that happened in the 50s is we acquired Alaska and Hawaii. So expansion economically, expansion through land, and expansion through having all those babies. So all those okay boomer jokes, here you go, the baby boom. By the way, I'm not old enough to be a boomer. I'm a Gen X. Oh, look at these cutie patooties. So someone commented that it seemed like every other young housewife is pregnant. And so you see this huge birth rate increase happening right there. And then in the 50s, it started declining a little bit. In the 60s, it really started declining. Look at that wild car seat. Definitely not made for protection of the baby. But the baby gets to drive. 1 baby born every 7 seconds. Holy moly. Glad I wasn't an OBGYN nurse. Not that I was alive during that time. All right, so because we have this boom in families, and look at this traditional little family setting, very cute. They really needed to build more houses, and so you had this expansion also of suburban communities, right? So you got these tract homes, and people are just snapping them up. Kind of reminds me of Edward Scissorhands. If you've never seen that, that is a toss back to the 50s. So imagine if you could buy a house for under $8,000. Wow, because today it's probably closer to, I looked this up, and the median was over $900,000 in California. Median meaning the middle ground, right? Certainly my home is not worth that, but wow. All right, another thing that changed in the 50s is before the 50s, if you were dating someone, it was a courtship. It was intended to lead toward marriage. But when the 50s came and the boys came back from overseas, and I say that not because I'm not a feminist, but because traditionally soldiers were male. But we see a rise in casual dating, right? So dating someone for the sake of dating someone, not for the sake of necessarily getting married, although that was a big deal. Women were expected to get married young. All right. So once a woman finished high school, or perhaps started college, it was very looked upon for them to find someone to marry, right? Now, if someone couldn't find someone to marry, they could get a job. Now, they were kind of stuck with certain jobs, ones that were considered women's jobs, right? You could be a teacher. You could be a domestic laborer, which basically means, going in and cleaning houses or looking after children like a nanny. You could be a secretary, a librarian, a store clerk. But you really couldn't get out there and do things like engineering, for example. Now, during this time, people married younger. And what's really cool is the divorce rate lowered significantly. Like right now, it's in 30% divorce rate. So not quite half that people always talk about. But people married younger and they stayed married during the 50s, right? So it was only about 2 divorces per 1,000 marriages. And of course, more babies were born. All right, so we have all these new products. So when the economy is good, there are more inventions that come out. There's more advances in technology. There's more people coming out with all these ideas that they can now afford to back or find funding for. And so people were really getting into plastics in the 1950s, which we know now is kind of a detriment to our society and our environment. But that was a big deal back then. Transistor radios were new. Here's Mr. Potato Head, and what's wild about this is you literally would use a potato or any other fruit or vegetable you had on hand. In fact, my father-in-law still has his original Mr. Potato Head, and it's just a bunch of metal pieces you cram up into this potato. Pretty wild. Super glue came up. The television became popular. People could afford to buy TVs, and that kind of took off huge. Now, we also have planned obsolescence, which means that you design a product not for it to last a long, long time, but you design it so it will go out, so that you will require either service or to buy a new one. Kind of janky, not very good. So if you've got a fridge and it conks out after 5 years, dang, you're spending a lot of money on that fridge, but it was planned to be that way. Sad. And the car. Oh my goodness. American homes, they really wanted to get that car in there. So, way back in the 20s when we had mass production coming out and the Model T and all this great stuff, which my grandmother actually, I think she broke her wrist trying to wind up the crank thing. But in the 50s, cars were becoming a big deal. Look at these bombers. Look at some of these amazing cars that they came up with. And so people were able to afford to buy a family car, and in some cases, maybe even 2. So the car kind of changed things for people. And you kind of had this drive-in culture that came up. And this drive-in culture meant that you could drive in and eat at McDonald's. You could do this drive-in diner. You could go to drive-in movies. And so it really increased what people were able to do and what they did do for recreation and dating. All right. Some inventions, and you don't need to know all of these, but I just wanted to point some of these guys out. Look at that ginormous computer at the bottom right. Holy cannoli, right? So during this time, the computer, computers were round, but it was the first time they had computer hard disks. First time they had lasers. First time they had a microchip was in the 1950s. That's why they had all these tubes. So when someone got a bug in their code, it literally was because a bug flew in and messed up the tube and the connection, and so you would have to go in and get the bug out. So that's where we get that idea from. Credit card, the first credit card ever. It was a diner's card came out, which probably is to our detriment because then people, can spend over their limit and live beyond their means. Television, of course, were big purchases. Power steering was invented, and if you have ever driven a car without power steering, you will know how much you would love power steering. Our truck did not have power steering, and I'll tell you, wow, trying to get yourself out of a tight spot, really hard. Oral contraceptives, so now women could choose not to have children. McDonald's came about in the 1950s. I want to say it was either 51, 53, or 55. The Barbie doll came out, and already we said the microchip and laser. Pretty cool time to be living. All right. And again, that's if you're white. And we'll see why in a little bit. All right. So the rise of the television, look at that. We went from, in 46, people, about 7,000 TV sets. So you would think probably the most wealthy had them. And then by the 50s, holy cannoli, 50 million TV sets. And by the 60s, 9 out of 10 families had at least one. So look at all these programming, right? I Love Lucy, Lone Ranger. Look at these boys watching this cruddy old TV. But, that was a big deal. Like, holy cow, we don't have to listen to the radio to get our stories. We can see them. And this enabled a lot more people to watch television. So because of that, TV kind of indoctrinated everyone to try to celebrate traditional American values, especially that of the white suburban family home. And there we have Superman. All right, so we had shows like Donna Reed, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, Ozzie and Harriet. And so really it portrayed a middle-class suburban life view. And of course, the conflicts they would face in these shows were not really serious conflicts. It would just be a minor conflict, like Beaver getting his head stuck between the fence at the park, and they have to come and get him out. Hilarious, I think. Anyway, but it really didn't portray people of color. It really was geared toward a certain type of people. You certainly wouldn't see, a white person of lower class, let alone anyone of color. Okay, this is wild to me. And I titled this slide Health. Because, look at this. They're portraying doctors as saying, hey, doctors like Camel cigarettes, that's what you should smoke. Or scientific evidence on effects of smoking show that these are good for you. Or at least not the worst for you. And then look at this little boy. They're going to give this tiny baby cola because it's good for him. No. And then you've got no flies on me thanks to DDT. Well, we know now DDT is nothing but poison, right? So we don't want to be using that around our vulnerable populations. And then check out this sad child. Before you scold me, Mom, maybe you better light up a Marlboro. Now, if you look over there at Mornidine was thalidomide. And thalidomide was something they offered pregnant women, and they really pushed that pregnant women take this to help with, morning sickness and all sorts of other problems. The problem is it caused horrible birth defects. If you ever want to watch a documentary, there are several on there about people who, they were born without hands, born without legs, just so many birth defects. And they kept pushing this and pushing this. And then when it started coming out, what was happening, they came to America and pushed it here. Really sad. All right, let's get to what you might be interested here. Teen culture. Oh, look at this. Now that guy would have been called, I think, a soda jerk. So they're at the soda fountain, as you can see there. And she's having herself a nice malt or whatever. All right, so the word teenager really entered the American lexicon during the 1950s, right? So someone between 13 and 19, they started marketing towards teens specifically at that time, trying to get them to get into, the clothing and the shoes and the types of things they're trying to sell to teens specifically to show that they are a different demographic and not like their parents, which is an interesting concept because it goes a little bit against the idea of conformity, which we'll see in a little bit. All right, so you were expected in the 50s to conform, meaning act as you're supposed to act. You obey authority. You obey your teacher, the policeman, whoever is in control. You control your emotions. You don't just cause a scene because you're upset, right? You fit in, and for God's sake, don't you touch another person in that way. All right. And this is interesting because rock and roll was coming out in the 50s, and that was kind of changing things. This is interesting because gender norms were really, really strict. Now we talk about gender fluidity, but if you think about back then, girls were expected to wear dresses, men were expected to wear nice clothes, at least a sweater vest, if not a suit. But you were supposed to keep your looks up at all times and really fit into your gender stereotype, because that would be your best way of being successful in society. Now, yes, from time to time, women could wear pants, but it was really kind of frowned upon to do too often. But a woman could have a very feminine pantsuit. But really, most women stuck to dresses and heels. Dear God, I would have died back then. All right, dating rules. Look at all these great rules. So girls weren't allowed to ask out boys. Boys had to ask them out. You'd be considered a floozy if you were a girl asking a boy out. And a boy was expected to ask for the date a few days before the intended time. It would be very rude and unlikely for a boy to call up and ask to go out that night. It's almost like he wasn't considering the girl at all. Didn't give her advance notice, right? Maybe she's a second choice. And no girl wants to feel that way. You dated one person at a time. You weren't supposed to date multiple people because that was rude. Be on time to the date. Don't break the date. I mean, you'd have to have a pretty good excuse to get away with breaking your date. No hanky-panky. No kissing. That is just naughty. So when the boy came for the girl, he didn't just drive up and honk for her to come out of the house. No, he was expected to come to the door, ring the bell, come in and meet the parents, and then ask the parents, what time would you like me to have her home? And dang it, he better be on time with her, because her parents were the ultimate say in whether you would get a second date with this girl. All right, the boy should be very chivalrous, help her with her coat, open the door for her, order her food. It would be kind of uncanny for a girl to just order her own food when going to a restaurant, because that's just not how it was done. And the boy always paid. If a girl tried to pay, it would be an insult to the boy, as if he couldn't afford it or something. Right? When you're walking down the street, the boy should always walk between the curb and the girl to protect her and to show that he is capable of protection. And if they went steady, meaning they were going to be exclusive, they were going to continue dating, they would exchange something. He might give her a ring or a pin, and that would be a sign that they are together. All right. Also, once you're going steady, you would check in with your partner. And any kind of occasion, you'd be expected to go together to. It's very different today. I mean, I once even didn't go with my husband to Thanksgiving. I went to another Thanksgiving because I'm an independent woman. All right. And of course, women, I'm not going to go through all this, don't worry. But I just wanted to show you that it's kind of a traditional thing for women to have certain rules, right? So when your man comes home, make sure that house is clean. Everything better be picked up. Act super happy to see him. Have something for him. Look your best. Make sure you touch up your makeup and your hair. You know, you're not going to have him come home to you in sweats, eating chips on the sofa. What kind of woman are you? And then I love this last one. A good wife always knows her place. Oh boy. Some girls out there are like, what? Some boys out there are like, yeah. All right. So as I was saying, rock and roll was kind of a big deal. You have Elvis, Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis to start, right? And people were like, oh, that rock and roll. Oh my goodness, it's so naughty. I don't want my child listening to that fast music. Because remember, it was all about conformity, right? And let's not leave out the amazing contributions that African Americans made to music, right? You have Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Nat King Cole. He's one of my favorites of all time. Ella Fitzgerald, my daughter's favorite, right? And they were making these amazing records. If you ever want an interesting fact, look up Ella Fitzgerald and Marilyn Monroe and see what Marilyn did to try to help Ella out in her career. Really cool. All right. Another thing that was kind of breaking with conformity, where you have these movies and these books coming out where you have kind of this rebel, this person who's not acting as they should. They're misunderstood, you know? And it was kind of just an exciting thing for teens to see other supposed teens acting in such a way. All right, we also had the Beat Generation. So the Beat Generation were people writing about not being a conformist. So for example, there's a book titled Steal This Book to encourage people, you know what, go against the grain. Do something daring. Don't just fit in. Don't just do what you're told to do. Right? And unfortunately, they kind of got this name Beatnik, right? So you can see the clean teen on the right, and then the Beatnik. Look at his slobby self over there. I'm really not judging, but he's got his bongos, and that would have been a stereotype, right? The people of the Beat Generation would not have called themselves Beatnik. All right. So we had this cult of domesticity, and all I'm going to say about this is that women had their role, of doing these things, joining the PTA, helping the campfire girls, entertaining guests like her husband's boss or whatever, and she's expected to keep herself up and make the house look nice, and the kids should be behaved. And the man was supposed to be a good provider and a protector and rule the house. So you might have heard someone say, just you wait until your father gets home. He was a disciplinarian. You were supposed to be afraid of your father to some extent. It kept you in line. All right, but we also have more women going into the workforce during the 50s as well. I mean, look at that. By 1960, 40% of women are working. All right. Now, on the other side of things, we have people who are struggling for rights, right? And so there were a lot of movements that rose up in the 1950s. The fight for civil rights, it wasn't necessarily shared by, but it certainly appealed to African Americans, Latinos, women. There was an anti-nuclear movement because, that bomb we dropped in Hiroshima, holy moly. Environmentalism started. It wasn't real strong then as it is now, but it certainly did start. And then we had a lot of artistic, musical, and intellectual advancement all the way around. So some things I want you to know about this real quick here is there was still segregation, right? So if you were black, you couldn't go to a white diner. You couldn't go to the movies where white people go. There were still Jim Crow laws. If you were white, you could not marry a black person and vice versa. You could not marry a Latino or a Filipino. That was not okay. And so there was all this segregation that kept people on their track. Stay in your lane, right? And they weren't allowed to vote either. All right. So you have someone like Rosa Parks that we consider brave, and she's so humble. She said, I wasn't brave, I was just tired. But she didn't go to the back of the bus. And that kind of being just fed up with everything really sparked so much in the civil rights movement, and it led to this huge bus boycott. Then you have Brown versus the Board of Topeka, this case that said, hey, segregation in schools is not okay. And they sent these 9 kids into white schools. Now look at that picture on the bottom right here, right? That one woman glaring at this poor girl, the woman behind her shouting things at her. They were awful to these poor kids who went into this other school, right? But, they tried to stick with it, right? And then in 1960, if you see over in the left-hand side, there's the Woolworth sit-in, where a bunch of African-American youth, as well as some of their white friends, had a sit-in to try to show that they weren't afraid, they were going to eat at the diner, even if they weren't going to be served, they were going to stay. And you can see they're having things poured on them, and it did turn rather violent. People didn't like that kind of a change back then. Martin Luther King, he came about, he definitely was present in the 50s, but he really grew in his status and his message in the 60s. Then we have Cesar Chavez. And he was a Latino who had to drop out of school. Oops, sorry for the typo there. And he organized in 52 the Community Service Organization. And that was a way for Latinos to fight discrimination. Now, a lot of times you may think of discrimination as calling someone a bad name or hurting someone, but there's a lot more to it than that. It's denying opportunities. By saying, for example, if you are Latino, you're not allowed to have this job that pays better. You're not allowed to have these rights, simply based on either your origin or the color of your skin. Cesar Chavez did a lot for the civil rights struggles for Latinos. All right. Now, just to kind of sum up what the 50s were about, you have this list. I'm not going to go over the whole thing, but this is pretty much what we have discussed this whole time. And I didn't get really into feminism, and there also were some changes in the Filipino community back then as well. So I'm not going to get into all that. There's certainly so much more to know about this time. It was very complicated, very complex, and rich. All right, guys. Once you are finished with your notes, you can go ahead and upload them to Canvas. And hopefully now you are ready to kind of be in the spirit of our reading that's coming up.